Hello, my name is David Boas. I'm Director of the Neurophotonics Center at Boston University. And today it's my pleasure to tell you about our efforts to develop technology to enable neuroimaging in the everyday world. To accomplish this, we're going to be building a portable, miniaturized, lightweight wearable system that integrates fNIRS, EEG, and eye-tracking. So this picture here depicts very nicely our plan to integrate fNIRS emitters and detectors with EEG electrodes to cover the whole head to be controlled by wearable electronics, which in addition, we're going to integrate with eye tracking and scenery cameras to allow us to couple the brain activity patterns we're measuring with the stimuli that are engaging the subject in natural environments. So I want to just recognize my team at Boston University who are really advancing all of the technology, and the faculty at Boston University and their colleagues that are leading the demonstrative applications for this technology. So our project only just began a few months ago. So today I'm just going to focus mostly on the background and rationale that motivates our technological advances. And the motivation really begins with fMRI, which over the last 30 years has had a tremendous influence on our understanding of how the brain works. But fMRI does have limitations. Principally, it limits the study of natural behaviors in ecologically valid settings, and it limits our ability to study all subjects and patient populations. Excuse me. fNIRS and electroencephalography allows us to overcome these limitations, principally because they're much more miniature technologies, and the miniaturization of electronics is actually driving these technologies to be truly wearable technologies that do not constrain the movement of the subject. fNIRS, just a little bit of background, is using near-infrared light to measure the hemodynamic responses to brain activity, very much like fMRI measures the hemodynamic responses to brain activity. EEG uses electrodes that monitor the electrical potential changes that arise from synchronous neural activity. The combination of the two technologies will give us a much more complete picture of the underlying brain activity patterns. Already, efforts are being made to integrate fNIRS and EEG as wearable technologies. And indeed, we saw two commercial companies at NIRX, an fNIRS company, Brain Products, and EEG company. They demonstrated already in April of 2020 the integration of their instruments. But this development is really in the early stages, and much more optimization is needed to realize the full potential of the integration of these technologies, and that is the purpose of aim one of our project. In addition, we need to integrate these neuroimaging methods with multimodal sensors of the subject and the environment to facilitate the connection of the brain activity patterns we observe with the external stimuli driving those brain activity patterns. The integration with eye tracking and scene cameras will greatly facilitate that, and there will be tremendous advances needed in just analysis methods to combine all of these data and interpret these data. In combination, this technology is really going to enable tremendous growth in the repertoire of behavioral studies that can be done and studied to advance our understanding of the behaving human brain. So not just in the everyday world, but of course, reducing these constraints will allow a much greater number of controlled studies in the lab. And to begin with, we're going to be focusing on studies of walking, interacting, and perception. These tasks alone, and particularly in combinations, are very challenging to study with fMRI. In addition, people with neurological disorders can be greatly impaired in their ability to perform these tasks. So the wearable technologies we're working on, we believe, are going to greatly advance our understanding of the brain activity patterns associated with these tasks in healthy subjects, and how that brain activity goes awry in neurological disorders, and that will eventually allow us to better treat these patients. So in the context of Parkinson's disease, we'll be studying brain activity patterns associated with subjects walking in natural settings that they are interacting with and perceiving. In the context of stroke, We will be studying the brain activity patterns associated with conversation between two subjects, how those brain activity patterns are disrupted by stroke, and how a patient can restore those brain activity patterns as they restore their ability to communicate. And finally, in the context of perception, we're going to build on the tremendous advances afforded by fMRI, advancing understanding of attention and working memory, and moving that to more ecologically valid settings. We're starting off with a free-range concentration game, where a subject will be moving around a room, finding objects. We can easily introduce distractors into the setting as a model of attention and working memory in everyday activities. So we started building fNIRS hardware back in 1998. This rapidly evolved to an imaging system that we built in collaboration with a contract engineering company, TechN. This resulted in our imaging system in 2004. I think about 100 of these systems were distributed around the world. At that time, the hardware technology was way ahead of the analysis methods and the experimental procedures. And so at that time, we really turned our focus towards advancing analysis methods, time series analysis methods, anatomically guided analysis methods. We developed these open source software packages that have been that are utilized by thousands of people around the world. There's also a growing number of other open source software packages made by many other people. This is really, in addition, we helped grow a diverse and large and still rapidly growing community of fNIRS users. And this community now is ready for more technological advances. And indeed, about 5 years ago, we started to see more and more academic groups developing wearable fNIRS systems. This was motivated by the growing number of fNIRS users and enabled by just the miniaturization of electronics that we've been seeing. Most recently, at a recent data blitz at the Society of fNIRS, we just saw that there's really rapid growth happening in the wearable fNIRS technology development, and indeed commercial companies are now beginning to sell wearable fNIRS devices. About 5 years ago, we started developing our own wearable fNIRS systems. We were supported by an NIH 24 grant that enabled us to build this system that drives right now 8 optodes, and we're distributing this to 20 users around the nation and the world. This made us realize that we can miniaturize the sources and detectors even more, and led to our present UO1 project, where we're going to miniaturize the electronics even more and build a system with 36 sources, 108 detectors to cover the whole head. So why 36 sources, 108 detectors? Well, one, we want whole head coverage, so we need more optodes. We also want overlapping measurements. About 10 years ago, we published this study where we investigated how much improvement in spatial resolution we could get by having overlapping measurements compared with the more traditional non-overlapping measurements that happen today. And we chose a hexagonal pattern because it allowed us to cover the whole head with a smaller number of sources and detectors. The alternative approach is to use a grid pattern. This is what Adam Agerbrick and Joe Culver have been leading for the last decade with a series of very nice papers. They've shown that this grid pattern allows for more overlapping measurements, allows for further improvement in spatial resolution, but this comes at the expense of actually having to do more source multiplexing because you have an even number of sources and detectors. Whereas hexagonal pattern, we actually have more detectors and then sources, and so we get more measurements happening in parallel, and so less source multiplexing is needed. Additionally, it's interesting to look at the distances between sources and detectors for the hexagonal pattern versus the grid pattern. And what we notice if we look at the second, third, and fourth nearest neighbor distances relative to the nearest neighbor distance for the hex pattern, it's about 20% closer than for the grid pattern. What this enables us to do is if our design criteria is to have the second nearest neighbor distance at 30 millimeters, which is what we need to see the brain activity in an adult human subject, this allows us to cover the head with fewer optodes using a hexagonal pattern than a grid pattern. And so this gives us the benefit of reducing the weight of the optodes on the head. It will extend our battery life for a wearable system. And because it's a hexagonal pattern, it improves our duty cycle, which will give us a better signal to noise ratio. Of course, one could always then imagine expanding in the future to a grid pattern to get an incremental improvement in spatial resolution. So right now, this coming year, we're really focusing on advancing that hardware. But in parallel, I really wanted to understand how we could do high density measurements with a wearable system. And so in that respect, I was very fortunate that my former postdoc, Alexander von Lumen, over the summer became scientific director for NIRX, which is one of the commercial companies selling fNIRS systems. And he was able, just before the holidays, to lend us their wearable NIRS Sport 2 device that has 16 sources and 16 detectors. So during my holiday break, I designed a hexagonal high density probe using our Atlas Viewer software. I then 3D printed that cap to hold the optodes in my designed locations over the motor sensory cortex. I was able to add the optodes from the NIRS Sport 2 device to that cap, and then perform a finger tapping task and see my brain activity pattern in the motor cortex. So this has worked very well, and I'm very happy with that. And it bodes well for proceeding to whole head coverage, where we'll need an increased number of sources and detectors. So the NIRX device can be expanded to 64 sources, 64 detectors. We'd have to have 4 of these devices. That's going to become much less portable. And it doesn't give us enough number of optodes to cover the whole head. So we're talking with them about how they could achieve that commercially, but in parallel, we're expanding our Ninja NIRS wearable fNIRS system to cover the whole head in a wearable package. And we hope to achieve that in the next 18 months. Now, with either fNIRS system, it's going to be a straightforward task to integrate those with EEG and the Tobii eye-tracking classes. We will be putting engineering effort into designing our optical detector to integrate with the active electrode. We're choosing to do that with the detector because it's pretty much electrically quiet and will not interfere with the EEG, whereas the optical source has current switching to drive the light sources, and that would cause crosstalk in the EEG electrodes. In addition, we'll be looking at the designer of our whole head coverage to make sure that the co-placement of the detectors and the electrodes are at standard 1020 locations. Finally, I'd just like to mention time domain fNIRS has never really been a wearable fNIRS technology. However, in October, this company Kernel just live streamed an event where they described their wearable time domain fNIRS system. Whereas presently all fNIRS systems are continuous wave devices, time domain uses a pulsed laser, and by time gating photons at longer path lengths, we're able to get we're essentially able to double our brain sensitivity. We and others over the last 20 years have been investigating time domain NIRS technology, but these were lab optical bench type systems, definitely not portable. Kernel engineered a very portable time domain system and grew it to cover the whole head with 52 pulse lasers and over 300 time resolved detectors. And this is even integrated with 8 EEG channels. So we're hoping to get our hands on one of these systems in April and test it to see how well it will work for enabling neuroimaging studies in everyday world environments. So with that, I think it's pretty clear the instrumentation is advancing very rapidly for enabling ecologically valid studies of brain activation. We're looking forward to using these technology advances to do demonstrative studies of walking, talking, and perception, and advancing the analysis methods, and as well as working with a larger community of people who are interested in advancing these technologies. So thank you for your attention.